Welcome everyone to Mission Control's Breakfast Briefing, a cybersecurity and privacy primer for nonprofits. Next slide. Mission Control was founded in 2018. We're a New York City-based nonprofit think tank. Our members are seasoned professionals and business leaders who are deeply involved in supporting and working with the nonprofit sector. We work to empower change makers and advance the global nonprofit community. We do this by having master classes, leadership exchanges, and briefings like this morning's to help facilitate a collaborative culture and partnership among nonprofit leaders. Our members include Neil Fleischman, Bobby Giordano, Hope Goldstein, Jeff Ledette, our speaker today, Chris Moscovides, myself, Josh Nathan, Heidi Sidley, Jennifer Smith, Raj Thacker, and Claudia Zeldin. Each of us work in businesses that support the nonprofit sector. Our speaker today, Chris Moscovides, is a seasoned professional in the area of privacy and cybersecurity and does a lot of work helping nonprofit organizations as well as for-profit organizations establish their policies and procedures and technical protections to make sure that they are meeting their obligations with respect to privacy and cybersecurity. People don't necessarily realize how vulnerable they may be, but in the news recently, we've seen the JBS hack, the Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds hacks. And every day there are smaller hacks that don't make the paper, and these hacks can be quite disabling. There are also less dramatic privacy and cybersecurity breaches that occur. And Chris is going to give us an outline of some things to consider so that nonprofit leaders can meet their responsibility and establish basic policies and procedures around this area. And with that, and let me mention, Chris is the author of 2 books, including Privacy Regulations and Cybersecurity, published by Wiley, an Essential Business Guide. And he is the CEO of TMGE Media, which is the business through which he assists and his team assists companies in establishing appropriate privacy and cybersecurity policies and procedures, and when necessary, respond to hacks and breaches. With that, let me turn today's presentation over to Chris for our inaugural breakfast briefing. Chris?
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. Thank you for everybody that is here. I know that there's nothing says good morning than attending a privacy regulations and cybersecurity talk. So a couple of things. Number one is you are all going to get this presentation available online, and also if you would like it, you can get it as a PDF. Also, as part of our pro bono work, I will be delighted to come into your institution and present this or an expanded version of this to your specific organization. Now, this presentation is the distillation of work that has happened over several years, and it involves workshops, it involves all sorts of things, and there is a lot of material here. So do not be alarmed that I'm going to be plowing through this very quickly, because in some instances we'll be getting into the weeds. I will try to keep the pace moving right along and point out the areas where we really need to pay attention. And keep in mind that the talk is not a technical talk. This is for the executive team and board. So let's start. The first thing we need to do is understand exactly what it is that we mean by privacy. And you will be surprised how many people stop right there. I mean, they sort of say the same thing that, the Supreme Court judge said about pornography. Like, I don't know what porn is, but I sure know it when I see it. It's the people feel the same way about privacy. I don't know that I have a very good definition, but I know what I consider private and what other people consider private and how I want to protect it. So let's get down to some definitions. So Merriam-Webster, my go-to, defines privacy as the quality of state of being apart from company or observation, seclusion, secrecy, and the like. And you will see a lot of definitions of privacy surrounding this topic of secrecy, which of course is a little bit of a circular definition, right? Oxford defines the state of being free from public attention. Now, Black's Law Dictionary, Josh's favorite, and the book in every law firm, defines privacy much more detailed in a legal way. And it's the right that determines the non-intervention of secret surveillance and the protection of an individual's information. It's split into four: physical, decisional, informational, and dispositional. And all of these things become important now that privacy becomes a regulatory concern. There are two giants in privacy research, and by the way, you may be surprised to know that privacy is a scholarly topic with a substantial volume of work behind it, and some of the studies are just straight out delicious, including Alan Weston's, professor of public law and government at Columbia, and Irvin Altman, professor and chairman of psych at the University of Utah. Weston's book, Privacy and Freedom, is considered to be a foundational text. Weston defines privacy as the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. This, again, is important, and you have to remember that when we're talking about privacy and regulations and cybersecurity, the culture of any specific organization becomes a critical part of the conversation. And culture is determined not only by the group of people that make the company, but also its location, its history, and so on and so forth. This is very, very important. You can't create privacy or cybersecurity programs that are devoid of privacy. So getting into the states of privacy state, solitude, intimacy, anonymity, reserve, the privacy purpose of functions that correspond to each one are on your screen. Solitude maps to personal autonomy, intimacy to emotional release, anonymity, self-evaluation, and so forth. Weston's position is that privacy operates at three levels: the individual, the group, and the organizational. In our world, what this means is that when we are creating privacy policies, we need to address this triad. Okay, this is very, very important. The Weston segmentation that you also see on your screen is something that you will intuitively recognize, right? Because you know of your own social circle. There are the privacy fundamentalists. There are people that place a very serious premium on privacy, and that's about 25%. There is the privacy unconcerned, which couldn't care less about privacy. And they say, Weston says that this is making about 20% of the population. Nevertheless, the study is about 20 years old, and I would argue that this number has now grown substantially. And finally, the privacy pragmatists, the 55% of the population who essentially click, accept on every, thing that they see on the screen, but at least the pragmatists actually read it before they accept it. This is part of the, history of privacy, especially as it applies to legislation. And you can see that it starts in 1888 with the very, very famous treatise of law of torts and wrongs, which arise independently of contract. The Warren and Brandeis piece in the Harvard Law Review is still something that is considered as a seminal document in the study of privacy. And of course, it's very hotly debated as well. So, regulations. We are not going to spend an enormous amount of time on regulations. I'm just going to go through three important steps as you create an executive summary of your privacy profile. And then I'm going to hand it over to Josh, who is going to speak briefly about some of the American regulations, and we will resume. So what do you need to do to create an executive summary company privacy profile? Say that 20 times fast. You'll need to collect some data, okay? It starts with annual revenue, where you're doing business. This is absolutely critical because regulations can be regional. And then you're going to start your your PII profile, personal identifiable information profile, and start answering questions. Do you collect PII in any form? What kind of PII do you collect? Where is it stored? How is it processed? How much PII do you access? Where do you store it? How long do you store it for? How do you dispose it? How do you guarantee that it has actually been disposed? And essentially, what do you do with the PII? Do you sell it? Is it essential to your operations? And so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that we in the nonprofit community really have to concern ourselves here is, of course, what? The donor database. right? The donor database, irrespective of the size of a nonprofit you are, becomes absolutely mission critical, and it is just full of PII. You need to identify that, you need to categorize that, and you need to know what it is. Once you have done this, you need to identify the various jurisdictions or regulations that impact the business. So at a minimum, you need to know jurisdiction and regulatory background, intent and major provisions, PII definition. Remember, law defines personal identifiable information differently region by region. What's the inclusions, exclusions, enforcement, agencies, and penalties? In other words, how much? Number 7, penalties is really important because, as we will go through a little bit later, you need to understand how much compliance to regulations is going to cost, because believe it or not, complying with regulations in cybersecurity and privacy program development, it has to do with controls. Controls are expensive, and controls can never cost you more than the value of the asset, right? So therefore, if the penalty to comply with this regulation is very, very small, there are organizations that make the conscious choice to pay the penalty. That essentially buys them a little bit of runway. It's not a solution, but it's one way of dealing with controls. And finally, get to know the 800-pound gorilla, GDPR. GDPR is not going anywhere. It is the gold standard in privacy legislation. It started in Europe and so on and so forth. CCPA in California is a derivative of that, and there is similar regulations that are all over the United States that are derivative of GDPR. So I'm going to hand this over to Josh, where he's going to talk a little bit about what's applicable to us in the United States.
Good morning, everyone. As you can see from that map that just flew by, thank you, Chris. Every region has a different intensity of its privacy regulation. Things in red are regions in the world that have heavier regulations. Regions in gray have none that we're following, and regions in yellow and green have limited statutory privacy rules. The point of this is to show that it really depends on what regions you're dealing with as a company. If you're an organization located in New York, working with people locally, you don't have to spend much time worrying about what's going on elsewhere in the world. Leave that to your consultants. But if you are working internationally, then you have to be aware of some of the privacy regulations that come into play. If we take a look at the next slide, Chris, that is just a short list of some of the US privacy statutes or statutes that have privacy components to them. And as you can see, it's lengthy, and that's not a complete list. What's critical for any business or nonprofit to do is evaluate which of these statutes are likely to apply to them and build their program and procedures around those concerns. And I'll just highlight a few so that you get a sense of what really matters and what goes into putting a program together. You want to think about, as Chris mentioned, your donors, your employees, the people you serve, any proprietary information that you have, your secret sauce, if it's secret, children, and members, if you're a membership organization. These are the areas where you're most likely to have regulations come into play. And those regulations can range from HIPAA, which concerns medical information, which often runs through HR, ERISA, which has to do with retirement funds. Again, it's an HR, COPA, which concerns children. There's the California rules, which concerns people you're doing business with online. GDPR is Europe. That's the regulations that concern any organization that's doing business marketing and speaking to Europeans and collecting their information. So what we try to do is look at which are the areas that are most likely to be of concern. And some of these are taken care of by vendors and financial services organizations and other entities that your organization works with. But some of them are things that you have to worry about, particularly how you manage donor information, how you manage information you might collect from children, and how you manage the information from your employees and people you're engaged with. And so that's the basic framework that we build as we set out to create a proper set of privacy guidelines and controls. And that's just to give you a sense of the scope of what's involved. It looks overwhelming, but it really does shrink down to something far more manageable at the moment. But the regs keep getting added to, it keeps changing. There's a bit of Wild West, and it's incumbent on any executive leadership and board to, at least on an annual basis, check in and say, are we doing the things we're supposed to do? Has anything changed internally with our organization or externally? Last year, New York launched the New York Shield Act, a new set of regulations that have to be considered. So it's something that every organization at a governance at a top level should be having an annual quick checkup once they have their program in place. And so back to getting a program in place, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Josh. That was really very, very useful. And I think that if there's something that I could add to Josh's statements is it is absolutely critically important to get the board involved in these conversations. Remember that most board members at nonprofits are there because of their belief and strong support of the mission. And some board members are not particularly trained in governance of anything, of nonprofits or other businesses. They are there because they contribute a great deal, and they are there because they believe in the mission. Nevertheless, there are legal implications into being a board member, including the legal obligation of due care. So you must have a privacy and cybersecurity program in place, because if somebody walks through the door, either after an incident or just as part of an audit, you can't just answer, well, IT is dealing with this. IT is not dealing with this. You are. So we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds right now, and we're going to discuss cybersecurity, and we're going to map privacy onto a cybersecurity program. And we're going to do this in about 15 minutes. So excuse the speed. So let's start with a little bit of a definitions, okay? This definition here is my own definition. Typically, the definition of cybersecurity has to do with the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I have added safety to this definition as well. So we're going to go with this definition of cybersecurity, and the three components in cybersecurity that you need to pay particular attention to is: what are your threats? What are the vectors that these threats are getting delivered by? And what is the attack against your organization? Why is this happening? Are you a specific target? What's going on with your organization that elevates your profile? So let's look now at the pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic view of the environment that we have all been operating with, right? And these are the environments that have always been a concern of cybersecurity and privacy professionals, because we need to protect the data and the people that are working on the data in these environments. So typically, this used to be our world basically before last March. Now, during the pandemic, all sorts of things happen, including people working from home. So once that happened, the whole threat landscape changed enormously. We already had started seeing issues with bring your own device at work, where phones, private phones, are brought into work and integrate with corporate resources, and sometimes portables, like laptops that people bring from home and connect to the network to do that. Once the pandemic hit, all of this went right out the window. The people that were working from home, 99% of them were working on not corporate gear, but personal gear. And that personal gear did not necessarily have the same level of protection that the corporate gear had. Now, post-pandemic, things are starting to gel into a new world where there is a lot of working from home still. There's a lot of companies that are splitting it, that are saying, okay, half of us are going to go in, or a quarter of us, and so on and so forth. It's still gelling. There is no definitive, clear picture emerging right now, but we for sure understand that the threat landscape is changing a great deal, and we need to adapt both our privacy and cybersecurity programs to that change. Remember that cybersecurity is the ongoing application of best practices intended to ensure and preserve the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of digital information, as well as the safety. So let's map this. The confidentiality and privacy are two things that are really very, very closely interrelated. But privacy is a right of people. Confidentiality is a property of data, any data, not just personally identifiable information. And you may have noticed that I am like hand waving here a little bit on the on what is PII, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. Different areas of the world define PII differently. So things like is my name PII? Perhaps. Is my address PII? You will be surprised to know that your address is actually not PII. It becomes PII when it's actually mapped with another element. Privacy is a right to control access across a person's physical, decisional, informational, and dispositional dimensions. Confidentiality is an agreement on the rating of data. And what do we mean by that? Rating of data is things like top secret, public, secret. Those are kinds of ratings of data, especially when it applies to the confidentiality component of it. And finally, privacy is a right protected by law around the world. This is a little bit, of course, of wishful thinking, because we know very well that that is not entirely true as much as it should be. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is an attribute of data that can be regulated. So we are going to need domain expertise. In order to do all of this work, we're going to need domain expertise. And 99% of nonprofits don't have it, because mostly they don't have the budget, and they don't have the focus in this particular area. Remember, it's all about the mission. So, but briefly here, you can see the kind of expertise required when you're starting to build a cybersecurity program. And you will notice on the screen that there isn't much on privacy, right? This is the cybersecurity domains. This is what was going on before we were doing all of the work in privacy and GDPR. Oh, this is what it looked like. Now we need to map this into principles of privacy by design. The principles of privacy by design is the work of Anne Kevorkian, who is Canadian and who is incredible, amazing, walks on water on her bad days. And she developed the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design that are now essentially universally adopted and integrated in all sorts of different regulations. So how are we going to do this? We are going to pick a framework to do this, and there are many. In the United States, the dominant framework is NIST, National Institute of Science and Tech. And they have 3 frameworks right now, actually. They have the NIST CSF, which is the cybersecurity framework. They have the NIST PF, which is the privacy framework. And out for public comment is now the framework that is dealing with ransomware. And this is, as you can imagine, a very exciting piece of news. So the NIST CSF, you may have heard parts about NIST CSF. It has the 5 functions for the cybersecurity framework, which is identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? And the privacy framework maps this to identify, govern, control, communicate, and protect. We can spend a lot of time in this in the frameworks, but again, we are limited by time and scope of work. But suffice, there's a couple of things that we need to talk about. You will notice that there is no such thing as prevent function. And you would think, well, that's kind of odd. Don't we want to prevent attacks from happening? This is a very tricky thing, because cybersecurity attacks are not necessarily preventable any more than bank robberies are, even though you may have a guard at the door. So prevent is not a part of this. You will also find out that cybersecurity and privacy professionals talk about resiliency. And what that means is we sort of kind of secretly know that there is an attack coming. No matter what it is that we do, we applied pragmatic controls, we have good programs, we're doing all these things, but even under the best of circumstances, we suspect that an attack is going to happen. So what we try to do is build the resiliency in an organization in order to survive and thrive after these attacks. So how does NIST CSF and NIST PF intersect? There is cybersecurity risks, which are associated with incidents arising from loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. There is privacy risks, which is risks associated with privacy events arising from data processing. And there is cybersecurity-related privacy events. That looks like this. You have your identify, protect, detect, respond, recover for cybersecurity. You have your privacy risk, which is identify, govern, control, and communicate. And the things that they share together is the protect, detect, respond, and recover. This becomes critical as you try to manage the intersection of privacy and cybersecurity, because you cannot do it all, and you cannot do it all alone. So you have to put in boundaries. And this is how the boundary looks like. If you're dealing with cybersecurity and you've been charged with protecting the organization's cybersecurity, cybersecurity is your circus. Privacy is not your circus, and it's also not your monkey, because your monkey is the intersection. You have to deal with identify, protect, detect, respond, recover in cybersecurity, and you have to deal with protect, detect, respond, recover of privacy. You cannot deal with govern, control, and communicate, or even identify on privacy, because that is a totally separate function from IT and from cybersecurity. That is a business function, and it requires a lot of asset and business impact analysis work, which is what we're going to get into right now. So there's a lot of slides here that are getting into the weeds. Remember, you're going to get this printed and you can review it, but I'm going to have to walk you through asset valuations, business impact, and controls very, very quickly so that you get an idea, excuse me, of how this maps. So what is an asset? Start there. Anything and everything of value to your organization is an asset. Remember this: if it is of value to you, then it is of value to somebody else, and therefore at risk. Now, assets include data, hardware, software, systems, processes, and workflow. There are those that would add people here, but I find that somewhat demeaning. I don't consider people as assets. So working from your asset inventory, you need to ask two key questions per asset. Does the asset carry any privacy risk? This is a very important thing for you to know from the beginning. And does the asset carry any cybersecurity risk? This is a straight up risk associated with confidentiality, integrity, availability, and safety. Those are the starting points as you're looking through your assets. You can imagine that there is a lot of work having to do with that. The top 12 pieces of metadata and rankings that we need to do when we do an asset valuation is on your screen. You need to know who the owner of the asset is. And by the way, the owner of the asset is not the organization. Okay, there is typically a business unit that owns an asset that you're protecting. Because at the end of the day, obviously, the organization owns every asset, but we are doing this in a very granular way. Who is the custodian of the asset? Who is taking care of this asset? Where is the location? The PII classification. And here we start seeing some of what these classifications look like: anonymized, pseudonymized, explicit, or sensitive. The PII life stage: where are you with this piece of data? Are you collecting? Are you processing, storage, transferring, and so on and so forth? The confidentiality classification, the criticality classification: are you still in business if you lose this thing? Impact classification: how much pain is this going to cause? Maximum tolerable downtime: how long can you stay in business with this asset not available to the organization? What's your recovery point objective? When you recover the organization from an attack, how far back in time are you allowed to go? And how fast, the recovery time objective, how fast are you going to be able to go back into production? And finally, what's your resources? And use names. Resources are not academic. It's not the IT department or such and such a vendor. When something is happening, you need to be able to pick up the phone and call Bob or call Mary and have something done. So the privacy metadata of asset is not limited to PII classification and life stage. So if we are seeing it from the other side of the equation, which is the privacy equation, you may need to track a lot more metadata than just classification and life stage. For example, age, audit status, authorized users of PII, the classification, the content, and so on and so forth. There is a lot of data that you can collect. My advice to you is keep it absolutely simple and keep it pragmatic. How does this look in your organization very, very specifically? Do not overthink it. Do not panic. Do not get into the weeds and start collecting tons and tons and tons of metadata, because remember, you're going to have to manage all this stuff. So once you start down the path of asset valuation, the way that you're going to do this is through business impact analysis, okay? This is the part where you essentially go business unit by business unit and start going through all of the assets that need both privacy and cybersecurity protection. So for the life stage here, you're going to have to talk with your privacy professionals if you have one, or you're going to have to talk with the owners of the business units to identify what the life cycle of PII is, the personal identifiable information. And remember, the definition of PII is tricky, and it will be dependent on your geography, and it will be dependent on a lot of other things. This is definitely something that you must involve legally. Your lawyers have a lot to say about what PII is in your specific organization. So you're going to be creating a numerical score, right? It's 1 being less critical and 4 is most critical. Important safety tip. The 1 through 4 is not by accident. It could have been 1 through 5, but if you do that, you're going to have like the middle pivot problem. Most people are going to pick 3. So keep it to 4, keep it short and sweet, and start labeling things to that. Error always on the side of most critical. So this is an example. This is an example of PII, and we went through the business unit, and the business unit in working with us has identified the following values for their specific environment. So they ranked collection as number 4, they ranked processing as number 3, storage is ranked as 3, transfer is 4, and so on and so forth. So they got a score of 21 out of a possible 28. That's a very high score for that asset. That asset needs a lot of protection. So how do we manage this? Well, here's the secret. If you are a very large organization, nonprofit or otherwise, there are software applications that you integrate into your organization, and it integrates with your ERP system and your asset management system and so on and so forth, that can help in this process. If you are lucky enough or unlucky to have one of these systems, you will remember that they are very, very, very expensive, very frequently 6 digits, and they are also very difficult to operate. They are very complex because of, remember, all these domains, they're trying to cover all of this. Now, for the rest of us, the best way to run this is by having one spreadsheet to rule them all. And there are spreadsheets that we have, and they're available to you. You can go online to our site and get them for free. And these spreadsheets are linked. So when you put down all of these fields that you see on your screen, owner, custodian, location, all of this stuff are actually hot links. So you can click on owner CM, and then you will see all asset systems that CM is the owner. You can click on Impact 3 and see all of the systems that are on Impact 3. So you can see very quickly that such a spreadsheet would be very, very, very useful, especially if you're dealing with an incident. Now, I am going to flip through the screens very, very quickly because A, we're running out of time, and B, this takes a lot of time to go through it. But you essentially need to know, as you're managing these programs, what is the threat assessment out there. There are organizations that provide threat feeds, and NISA is the European version of this organization, and it's free, and you can get threat assessments from there. But typically, your cybersecurity vendor will be able to do that. The next thing you have to work with is vulnerabilities. The best place for you to go to is either at MITRE or OWASP and get all the vulnerabilities that you need to deal with. Again, your cybersecurity vendor is familiar with this, and depending on your environment, they will be able to see if any of these vulnerabilities apply to your organization and how you can patch it. Now, environments. The environments are what are you computing on? And these environments over the past 2 years have changed dramatically. Before the pandemic, everybody was talking about the cloud, and they had their email to the cloud, and maybe they did some storage in the cloud. After the pandemic, everything is on the cloud. Everything is on the cloud. The thing that I need you to remember is when we're talking about cloud, we are essentially saying that we're taking all of your hardware and moving it to somebody else's office. You are essentially moving your gear to somebody else's office. And if you have a key, then you have a private cloud. If you don't have a key to that office, then it's a public cloud. You have to worry about the Internet of Things. We have thousands of assistants now going all over the place, not only at home with with Googles and Alexas and all that kind of stuff, but also at work. And you also need to really think about distributed workforces, because right now all of the world is running on those forces. So there is advice here on what to do with these kinds of stuff, which I'm going to leave to you to read all, and we can discuss that a little bit further. And now we're going to jump into controls. Now, controls are hairy, expensive, and complicated. The controls that you're looking at here are controls that are mapping the cybersecurity controls to privacy controls. And there is a lot of questions about how we manage to do that. And it is a little bit tricky. It is organization dependent and a resource dependent to a very large extent. So I'm going to jump quickly to incident response because an incident will undoubtedly happen, be it a ransomware attack, be it an insider threat issue. Something is going to happen and you're going to have an incident. So now the thing in order for you to do it, to build resiliency and to move forward from an incident, is you need to have in place 4 things. You have to have a privacy program, you have to have a cybersecurity program, you have to have a business continuity plan, which is very, very different than a disaster recovery plan. You need to have all 4 of these plans. So the incident response plan is to be worth the ink it's printed on, must include the following thing. Identifying the incidents. How do you know that you have been breached? You know this by identifying and monitoring your environment. And that is a dog. This is difficult. You have to do it 24/7, 365 on every system that you have, every action, every event, everything. The way you do this is through the use of a tool called a SIEM, which is a Security Information and Event Management System. And you will be happy to know that SIEMs are not as expensive as you may fear. The next thing you need to do is you need to contain the incidents, to treat the incidents, you need to recover from the incidents, and then you need to review what has just happened, learn from it, and then do it all over again. You are living on this incident cycle all the time. And the way you build resiliency is you have to have done your homework ahead of time. All of the things that we were talking about before, all of the metadata about minimum time to recover and recovery points objective, recovery time objectives, all of these things help you a great deal when you're dealing with an organization with everybody's hair is on fire and running down the corridor saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, we have no computers. So now what? This is what you can do immediately as you leave this Zoom. Insurance. How do you identify an incident? How do you monitor your environment? And all of these kinds of stuff. And how does your insurance play with identifying and reporting an incident? You will be surprised to know that although you must have some sort of cybersecurity insurance plan in place, the cybersecurity insurances are now starting to go through the roof in terms of expenses, and also they tend to be very, very restrictive. Read your insurance policy for cybersecurity very carefully, because you will find that it says that unless you follow their specific steps, they don't want to have to do anything with you. And be very, very careful. These things are getting increasingly expensive because insurance companies don't want to pay off, of course, obviously. Who is doing what when? You need to know that. You need to know exactly who are the people that are responsible and are going to recover the site. Don't get into the weeds. Don't overanalyze. It's time to act. By the book and by the numbers. Remember, you have regulations to comply with and you have your plans in place. Follow the plans. Don't improvise in the middle of an incident. Stay pragmatic. Make sure you understand what's worth it to you. And then keep repeating this process in your organization before an incident happens. Train the people. Give cybersecurity and privacy awareness training. Make sure that the board understands what they're up to. Make sure that the executive team understands what they're up to. This becomes very, very important and critical in building resiliency. No organization is going to build resiliency if the executive team and the board don't care about either of those two things. So, I know that we applied very, very quickly on this. You will have this presentation. I am available to you to answer any questions that you may have in depth, and I am happy to take any questions that you may have now. Hearing none, I want to thank you very, very much for attending our inaugural breakfast brief. We are going to have a lot more coming up, both in terms of breakfast briefs and our master classes. So stay tuned and you will receive all that information via email. Thank you for coming.